The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone, to the second Janome Make Your Holiday webinar. My name is Nancy Fiedler, and I'm going to share with you some ideas and tips for winter accessories to dress up for the holiday. I added some extra details to commercial patterns to create some hats, an infinity scarf, and even a pair of fingerless gloves. These are great fashion accessories with a custom look, and they're great to wear and even give as gifts. I used the Janome Magnolia 7360. This is a great machine with 60 stitches, has a speed control and a needle threader. It's just like the perfect machine for any type of sewing. And then I used some additional accessories to make my pintucks and piping. So there's a pintuck foot wide and narrow, a piping foot, and a button sewing foot. And all of these accessories are available for any Janome sewing machine. The patterns I used were simplicity patterns. There was 6 hats on Simplicity 2494. And I found a fingerless glove pattern on Simplicity 1735. And then when I did some searching online, I found free directions to make an infinity scarf at the Simplicity website. If you go to simplicity.com, there is a free projects link, and you can scroll down to find directions on how to sew an infinity scarf. With the pintuck feet, I used twin needles to make the pintucks. So for the narrow foot, I used a 2mm twin needle, and for the wide pintuck foot, I used a 4mm twin needle. You can also use a 3mm twin needle with that foot. Then to make piping, I used 1/4 inch cotton cording, and for mini piping, I used 1/16 inch polyester cording. And then we all have assortments of buttons left over from other projects, or buttons we've received from our mothers and grandmothers. So I thought it'd be fun to add some buttons to one of my hats, and I used the button sewing foot to do that. The patterns called for fleece for the hats and gloves. And so whenever you're using a knit fabric, you want to use a ballpoint needle. And the Janome purple tip needles are perfect for sewing this type of fabric. They are a size 14 ballpoint needle, and they're going to help prevent skip stitches. When I started my projects, instead of using fleece, I used stretch velvet to give it maybe a little more holiday look. The first project I made was the Pintuck Hat, and it was in Simplicity 2494 View B. This pattern actually calls to make pintucks, but in the pattern they have you make a pintuck by folding the fabric and sewing a straight line. But the lines were already there on the pattern pieces, so this was a great help. So I simply cut out the fabric using the pattern pieces, and then using just the center line of the pintuck suggestion lines in the pattern, I drew one line to indicate where I wanted to sew my pintucks. Then I attached the pintuck foot narrow to my machine and inserted the 2mm twin needle. To make the pintucks, I just need a straight stitch. So I used stitch 1, which is center needle position. I always like to have my details show up, so I lengthened the stitch length to 3mm. When you make pintucks, you always want to wind your bobbin with the exact thread that you're using in your needles. So you'll need 2 spools of thread and then wind a bobbin of the same color. You'll need to use your auxiliary spool pin so that you can put both spools of thread on the machine. To thread the machine for a twin needle, simply take both threads and follow the thread path on the machine until you get above the needle. And at that point, you'll separate the two threads and thread each needle individually. Don't try and use your needle threader with the twin needle though. Then, to make sure that my pin tucks are nice and perky, you'll want to take a scrap of the exact fabric you're going to sew on and do some testing. You will need to tighten your needle tension. And I found that when I tightened my tension to 8 or more, I got very neat looking pin tucks. To make the first pin tuck, simply place the fabric with the drawn line in the center of the pin tuck foot and sew across the fabric. To make the next pin tuck, you're going to take the original pin tuck and place it under the groove in the foot. These grooves allow the foot to slide right over those pin tucks without crushing them as you continue on. So on my pattern pieces for the pin tucks, I sewed 3 to 5 rows of pin tucks at each section. So I used the drawn line as my center and added rows on either side of the first pin tuck that I made. What's nice about the pin tuck foot is there's grooves on either side of center, so you can do that. After all the pin tucks were done, I inserted that purple tip needle and attached my regular zigzag foot with the letter A on it. I just stayed at stitch 1 and put it back to normal stitch length, and then put the tension back to normal, or on the Magnolia, I set it back to auto. Then follow the pattern directions and make the hat. I thought it turned out really cute. After I made the hat, I thought it'd be fun to continue the pin tucks onto my fingerless gloves, so I could create like a ribbing along the cuff area. So the pattern for the fingerless gloves came from Simplicity 1735. It's View D. The pattern just calls for a single layer of fabric to make the gloves. But the stretch velvet doesn't have a very soft side, so I thought it would be nice to add some lining. So I purchased 1/4 of a yard of a cotton knit fabric and cut the lining pieces. And then I just set them aside to make my so I could make my pin tucks on the glove fabric itself. So to mark my fabric for the pin tucks, I just laid my quilt ruler across the bottom edge of the glove at 4 inches and drew a line to indicate the starting point for each of my pin tucks. I did use the narrow pin tuck foot and the 2mm twin needle again. But this time, in order to make the pin tucks, because I want to start in the middle of the fabric, I used one of my favorite stitches, the Lock-O-Matic. On the Magnolia, that is stitch number 3. And you'll find this stitch on almost every Janome sewing machine. The Lock-O-Matic stitch will sew forward 4 stitches, then automatically reverse 4 stitches, and then sew forward again. So it will do a locking at each at the beginning of each seam. It is center needle position, and once again I do want to lengthen my stitch length to 3mm and tighten the tension. So once again, do that little test to get your pin tucks looking nice and neat. So the line I drew is where I'm going to place the presser foot at the beginning of each line of pin tucks. I made the first row of or line of pin tuck about 3/4 inch from the side of the glove because that's going to be in the seam allowance and I don't need a pin tuck there. So I just sewed the seam so it automatically reverses at the beginning, and I sewed towards the end. About a 1/2 inch from that bottom touch the reverse button on the machine. It will sew in reverse 4 stitches, and it'll automatically come forward and stop. So keep your foot on the foot control after you touch reverse. Since the knit fabric is very soft and you're just sewing through one layer, you'll want to stop and touch this reverse about a 1/2 inch from the end. Otherwise, it might bunch up at the end. And this is all going to be covered when we put our lettuce leaf hem on there. So we want that fabric laying flat. To make the next pin tuck, you simply put the pin tuck that you first sewed in the second groove to the right of the needle and sew, and continue all the way across the cuff of your glove. This really creates a ribbing effect, and it was kind of fun. Once again, stop about 3/4 of an inch from the other side, because that will all get caught up in the seam allowance. After you've sewn your pin tucks, you want to reinsert that purple tip needle and put your zigzag foot on the machine. And I just returned back to stitch 1 and put your tension to normal, or once again on the Magnolia, put it back to auto. If you're adding the lining, there were a couple changes I did in the directions. The directions call for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but since I added the lining, that's going to take up some space inside. So I only used a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And at step 2 in the directions, instead of hemming the top edge of the glove, that's where I sewed or added my lining. So just place the lining and the glove right sides together and sew across the seam. Then I followed the directions to hem the thumb holes and sew the side seams. Then turn it right side out, tucking that lining on the inside. At this point, we have to add hem because we didn't do the hem that they called for in the pattern directions. And I thought a lettuce leaf hem would be just fun. So to do a lettuce leaf hem, you're going to select stitch 10, which is your zigzag stitch. You're going to adjust the width to the maximum width, which is 7 millimeters, and shorten the length to about 1 millimeter. You're going to sew through both layers. So you'll have the lining and the glove fabric under the presser foot right along the hem edge. And you're going to place that fabric under the presser foot so that the raw edge just falls inside the opening on the right-hand side of the foot. That way when the zigzag goes to the right-hand side, it just barely catches the edge of the fabric. I also like my needle to end, needle down when I'm doing this particular technique. So you're going to touch the up-down button one time so that the needle will go down, and then it will end down every time you stop. I started the machine and just sewed about 5 stitches to hold everything in place. Then to create the lettuce leaf, what you do is as you sew, you're going to gently pull the fabric and stretch it so it adds stretch while you're zigzagging. And when you get all the way around and take it off the machine, you get this nice little lettuce leaf edge at the bottom of your glove. I thought they turned out really cute. And as you can see, the lining will peek out along the top edge for just a little contrast color. And you will need to use your hand needle and stitch the thumb holes together. That way they'll stay together when you put your glove on and off. The next accessory I made was the infinity scarf. And this is just a really easy and fast accessory to make. But I decided to add some thick or wider Pintucks just to dress up this really lovely green stretch velvet that I used. I don't need to worry about securing the beginning and end of these Pintucks, so I just once again used stitch 1, straight stitch, center needle position. I lengthened that stitch to 3 millimeters and of course tightened my tension. On the scarf I wanted nice fat Pintucks, so I used Pintuck foot wide with the 4 millimeter twin needle. I didn't want to mark my fabric, so I used the quilt bar. This attachment comes with all of your machines. To use it, on the back of the shank is a little screw where the number 1 is. You just loosen it and simply slide the guide into the little hole and then tighten the thumb screw again. I just used my tape measure and measured 1 inch from needle to the guide to set it for 1 inch spacing. Then I simply sewed Pintucks spaced 1 inch apart the full length of my scarf all the way across the width. It was really easy. After those Pintucks were sewn, once again I put that purple tip needle back in, put on my zigzag foot, but I did go back to that stitch with the lock-o-matic, stitch number 3, and return your tension to normal. When you sew the infinity scarf, you need to start 3 inches from the ends. So you're going to fold your long fabric strip right sides together and place it under the presser foot about 3 inches from the end, and sew down the side. And you'll end 3 inches from the bottom. That way we have an opening to turn it. Don't forget when you're using the lock-o-matic stitch to touch the reverse button at the end of the seam so it will reverse and stop. You'll turn that scarf right side out and pin the short ends together. Then simply sew a 5/8 inch seam across the short ends. Once you take it under the machine and flatten out your scarf, you'll see you'll have about a 6-inch opening, and you simply need to close it with the hand needle. Once again, you'll find complete directions on the Simplicity website on how to cut the fabric for your infinity scarf. But they're very easy to make. In Simplicity 2494, there's a real cute beret on view F. And I thought this was the perfect project to add some piping to in between those tiers of the beret. So I needed the piping foot, 4 yards of 1/4 inch cotton cording, and then I purchased a 1/2 yard of a contrast fabric, and I just used a pretty cotton that worked well with my velour, and cut 6 2-inch by 24-inch bias strips from that contrast fabric. It needs to be biased so that it will lay nice in the hat. Sew all of those strips into one continuous piece. And then you're going to snap that piping foot onto the machine. Simply fold the strip around the cotton cording and place it under the presser foot so that the cording sits in the tunnel of the foot. We're just using our straight stitch, center needle position, and you're going to sew the entire length of the strip encasing that cording. After you've made your piping, you want to trim the seam allowance on that strip to 1/2 inch. Then I cut out my pattern pieces from my fabric. Just to make it simple, as I was placing the piping, I laid out all of my fabric pieces with the pattern pieces so I knew which piece went with which piece on a flat surface. And as shown in the picture, the piping is only going to go on the tiers. So this piece here was the band, so I don't want any piping on that. And there are 7 tiers. The piping is going to go on tiers 1 through 6. And it's going to go across the top edge of each of the tiers. So to sew the piping, lay the piping on the right side of the fabric, lining up the raw edges. Put that cording in the tunnel of the foot and sew it. Then the next step is to sew the tiers together. We need to leave the piping foot on because we need to have nice, neat seam. So what I like to do is I place my pieces right sides together, and the piece that I have facing up is the piece that I can see the stitches from the initial sewing of the piping on. Then you're going to touch the left arrow on the stitch width to move the needle to the left. That will once again make a nice neat seam and it'll cover the original stitches when you open the seam. And then just simply follow the pattern directions to construct the hat. I thought this turned out really pretty by adding that extra detail. The next hat I made had a brim on it, and I thought I wanted to add a little detail along that brim, but the 1/4 inch piping would be a little overpowering. So mini piping is the answer. To make mini piping, we're actually going to use the narrow Pintuck foot with 1/16 inch polyester cording. And the pattern has some flower, 3-dimensional flower details, but I thought it would be just as much fun to add some buttons instead of making flowers. So I dug around in my boxes of buttons and found some fun buttons to sew to the hat. So the first thing we have to do, of course, is make our mini piping. So we're going to need 2 2-inch by 24-inch bias strips from that contrast fabric. And once again, sew it into one long strip. When we're working with the tiny 1/16 inch polyester cording, it's a little easier to actually fold that bias strip in half lengthwise and press so we have a little folded edge to put that piping up against. Just be careful not to stretch it while you're pressing it. Then we're going to put that tiny cording inside the fold of the fabric, place it under the presser foot, and put it under the very first groove in that narrow Pintuck foot that's to the left of center. If the needle was in center needle position, though, I wouldn't be very tight against the cording. So you're going to move the needle position. We're going to be at straight stitch, stitch number 1, and move the needle position to 2.5. That way the needle will just skim that tiny cording and you'll get nice, neat piping. After you've sewn your piping, you're going to trim the seam allowance to 1/2 inch. The brim on the hat had little curves in it, so before I tried to sew the piping in place, I took my scissors and made thread snips about 1/2 inch apart, the full length of my piping. So just snip close to your stitches, but don't catch those stitches. Then put the piping in the groove on the foot and sew the piping onto that brim piece. After I made my brim, I just simply followed the pattern directions to complete the hat. So I just popped on that purple or course, I've been using the purple tip needle and the zigzag foot. In the pattern directions, they call for several rows of 1/4 inch top stitching. And I'm going to tell you a real easy way to get a 1/4 inch top stitching using your A foot. You simply need to move your needle position to 5.5. So you'll touch the right hand needle on the stitch width and it'll move that needle to 5.5. Then the right hand edge of your foot will become the guide. So you can just run the seam line right along the edge of your foot and you'll get beautiful 1/4 inch top stitching. So once again, I just followed the instructions to construct my hat. Then to sew my buttons on, I used the button sewing foot. It's designed with a wide area to allow you to see the holes of the button and has a little rubber grip that will help hold that button in place. So to sew the buttons on, I selected stitch 10, which is your zigzag stitch, and I dropped the feed dogs. On the Magnolia, I simply have to reach around on the back side of the machine as shown in the picture, and you can feel a little lever and you push it to the right and those feed dogs will drop. And we also need to adjust the width of the zigzag to fit the holes of the button. So what I do is I'll place the button on my fabric the way I want it, and of course lower my presser foot. Then turn your hand wheel slowly so that the needle goes into the hole. And then just keep turning it until the needle comes up and swings into the right hand hole. If it's coming down, it's going to miss the hole. You're going to need to adjust your width. So you simply need to touch the left hand arrow to narrow the width of that zigzag stitch. Once the needle clearly goes into both the left and right hole without hitting the button, you can step on the foot control and sew about 10 stitches in place. What I like to do is to turn down the speed on my machine when I'm sewing on my button. That way it makes it real easy for me to count the 10 stitches. Once you have your button sewn in place, simply lift the presser foot and pull out the fabric and leave about a 4-inch tail. That way you can pull the top thread to the back and tie a knot. When you sew buttons on with your sewing machine, they really stay on secure, and it's really fast. We have videos on how to use all of these accessories, and you can view them 2 ways. The first way is to simply go to the Janome website, janome.com, and click on the Janome Videos and Tutorials link. And it will take you to a new window. If you don't see the foot that you want appearing on the screen, across the top there's another little menu and you can click the one you want. There's ones for AccuFill quilting, sergers, accessories, MemoryCraft 12,000. So simply click the accessories and then scroll down and click on the link for the foot you want information on. These videos are really helpful. It reminds you on exactly how to set up the machine and how it should look while you're sewing. We also have an app for your mobile device. More and more of us are walking around every day and using our mobile devices for lots of things. The app is for iPad, iPhone, and Android devices. So you can go to janomespecials.com, mobile-video-app, and download this app for your device. I really had fun using the Magnolia 7360 when I made my accessories. It has all the features I needed for the pin tucks and piping. It had needle up, needle down, 7-piece feed dogs, which really handled that stretch fabric so well, and I could even drop them when I sewed those buttons on. There are 60 built-in stitches, so maybe my next hat I'll add some decorative stitches too. And the automatic thread tension made it so easy. When I had to tighten the tension, I knew always where to go right back to. And the speed control was great for going around the curves on the brim of the hat, as well as sewing on the buttons. Make sure to visit your local Janome dealer to get any of the accessories that I showed you today. And they are available for all Janome sewing machines. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope I've given you some inspiration for holiday gift giving or just accessorizing your own winter wardrobe. Thank you.